The hall was bright and full of soft whispers as people settled into their seats. The air felt warm from the stage lights, and the sound of quiet tuning came from behind the curtains. Everyone expected a long day of auditions with polished performers and perfect confidence. No one expected a small girl with a worn backpack and a broken notebook to change the entire room. She stood near the side of the stage, clutching the notebook close as if it were something precious. The notebook was thin, its cover bent at the corners, and the pages inside were wrinkled from being opened too many times. The girl looked nervous, her shoulders tight and her steps small. Yet she did not turn back. She kept walking until she reached the edge of the stage where the lights brushed her face. A stage assistant looked at her with surprise, because she seemed much younger than the usual performers. Still, the assistant nodded and motioned her forward. The judges sat in the front row behind the long table. 3 of them, each holding papers and pens. They glanced at her with mild curiosity, wondering if she had wandered into the wrong place, or if someone backstage had sent her by mistake. High above the rest sat the famous pianist invited as a guest judge for the auditions. He carried the calm confidence of someone praised his entire life. People whispered about him even before he arrived because his skills were known across countries. When he saw the girl step forward, he gave a small amused smile as if thinking she was too young for such a serious event. The girl reached the piano placed in the center of the stage. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held the broken notebook tight. She placed it gently on the piano stand, taking a moment to straighten the pages, even though they were already worn from use. The hall grew quiet as people realized she was not lost. She was here to perform. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. She said she would like to play her own music. The judges exchanged looks. They did not hear that very often. Most participants played known classical pieces or modern practice songs. But an original piece from someone so young was surprising. One judge raised an eyebrow in doubt, while another leaned forward with interest. The famous pianist gave a light chuckle that carried across the hall. He whispered something to himself and shook his head as if he expected very little from her. His reaction made a few people in the audience smile, thinking the same, but the girl did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the piano keys. Breathing slowly to calm her nerves, she adjusted the small stool. Her feet barely touched the floor. She took a deep breath, then placed her fingers on the keys. The hall fell completely silent. Everyone waited for the first note. The tension was soft but real, like the room held its breath with her. But when she tried to start, her hands shook again. Her first attempt at pressing the keys made a faint, uneven sound. It was not a mistake big enough to embarrass her, but enough to show how frightened she was. A few people in the audience exchanged quick glances, expecting the judges to stop her and move to the next participant. The famous pianist tapped his fingers on his seat, still wearing the same amused expression. It looked as if he believed she would give up or burst into tears at any moment. Yet the girl did neither. Instead, she closed her eyes for a second, remembering something that gave her strength. She thought of the little room at home where she practiced every evening. She remembered the old keyboard missing 2 keys. She remembered the way her mother used to sit beside her, listening with a gentle smile. Her mother always said that real music came from the heart, not from perfect practice. That memory eased her fear. She opened her eyes again, steadier this time. Her fingers hovered above the keys with new calmness. She took a deep breath, and the first real note came out. It was soft, warm, and full of feeling. Not perfect, but real. The sound spread across the hall, clearing the air like the first breeze after a long, quiet moment. The judges leaned forward with interest now. The audience stopped shifting in their seats. The famous pianist's amused smile faded just a little as he tilted his head, trying to understand the shape of the sound she made. Something about the tone was different. It had hesitation, pain, and hope all in one touch. She continued playing gently, letting the melody guide her instead of fear. Each note sounded like a memory she carried. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing became steady. The hall grew quieter with every second as people realized they were listening to something more personal than a typical audition. Her broken notebook rested open in front of her. The ink marks on the page were slightly faded, yet the music inside them felt new and alive. As she turned the page mid-song, her fingers never stopped moving. And for the first time since stepping onto the stage, she looked peaceful. Everyone who had doubted her now watched with silent focus, wondering what kind of story she was telling through those simple yet powerful notes. And though she looked small on that large stage, the music made her presence feel much bigger, filling the hall with something tender and unforgettable. By the time the final soft note faded, the hall was completely still, not a whisper, not a shuffle, just silence full of growing surprise. The hall stayed silent for a long moment after she finished her last note. The air felt different now, softer but full of something unspoken. People were not sure if they should clap yet or wait for the judges to speak. Even the lights seemed to soften around her as she remained seated at the piano with her hand still hovering above the keys. She slowly closed her broken notebook, carefully smoothing the wrinkled pages before lowering it onto her lap. She looked up at the judges with shy eyes, unsure of what they might say. The judges whispered among themselves in low voices, their expressions shifting from confusion to surprise and finally to interest. They had heard many young performers before, but none who carried such honest emotion in such simple playing. Then the famous pianist leaned forward in his chair. His voice carried easily through the hall because everyone was still so quiet. He said the words slowly, almost with a laugh under his breath. "This isn't a children's show." His tone was light but also dismissive, as if he believed her performance, no matter how emotional, was still too small for the stage she stood on. A few people in the back rows nodded, thinking he was right. They saw only a young girl with a broken notebook, not someone who could stand beside trained performers. The pianist folded his arms and added, "This stage is for those ready for real music, not playtime." His words floated across the hall, sharp enough for the girl to hear clearly. The girl did not react the way most expected. She did not look scared or offended. She stayed still, her hands resting gently on her notebook. She blinked once, then looked straight at the pianist with steady eyes. It was not a bold stare, but a soft one filled with quiet belief. That alone surprised him more than her music had. One of the judges cleared her throat and said gently, "She played something original," another judge added. "Her melody had a story," the third judge nodded slowly, tapping a pen on the table as if replaying the sound in their head. None of them spoke loudly, but their words carried across the room in a way that softened the previous tension. The pianist's expression shifted slightly. He still looked doubtful, but his eyes narrowed in curiosity. He waved his hand toward the girl and said, "You wrote that." His tone made it clear he did not fully believe it. He probably thought someone else had composed it for her, or that she had copied it from a song he had not yet heard. The girl opened her notebook again, turning it so the judges and the pianist could see the handwritten notes inside. The pages were marked with pencil lines, soft circles, and places where erased marks left faint shadows. It was clearly not the work of someone who copied music. It looked like a notebook filled with learning, mistakes, and heart. She spoke in a quiet voice that echoed more than she expected. She said, "I wrote it for someone I lost." The hall became still again. Her words touched something in the air, something heavier than the music. Even the pianist stopped moving his fingers and lowered his arms. His expression softened, not out of pity but out of recognition that her answer was honest. The judges shifted in their seats, trying to understand the meaning behind her words. The audience leaned forward, feeling a little more connected to her than before. She did not explain more, and she did not need to. The simplicity of her sentence held enough emotion to fill the room once again. The pianist spoke again. But his voice was less playful now. He said, "That song. Who taught you to play like that?" It sounded like he wanted to prove something. Or maybe disprove something. But the girl simply shook her head slowly and said, "I learned on my own." Her voice stayed steady, even though her fingers gripped the notebook tightly. Some people in the audience exchanged surprised glances. To learn alone, without lessons, without a real instrument, without guidance, seemed almost impossible. The pianist leaned back in his chair, looking at her with new thoughts forming in his mind. He did not laugh this time. He only stared as though he had just heard something rare and confusing. One judge asked softly, "Why did you come here today?" The girl looked down at her notebook before answering. Her voice carried a mix of fear and courage. "I wanted someone to hear the song," she said, "just once." The judges listened with growing respect, realizing this audition meant more to her than a competition or a prize. The audience grew quiet again, waiting to see what the pianist might say next. He opened his mouth as if ready to speak sharply again. But then he stopped as his eyes drifted back to the notebook in her hands. Something in the way she held it, gently but tightly, made him hesitate. He finally said, "Play something else." His voice was firm, not mocking now but testing. The hall reacted with a soft ripple of surprise. The judges exchanged looks, not sure if he was being fair or not. But the girl did not hesitate. She nodded once, placed the notebook back on the stand, and lifted her hands over the keys again. The hall leaned in as one, waiting for the next note that might once again silence every doubt in the room. The girl took a slow breath as she sat before the piano again. The judges leaned forward slightly, trying to read her expression. The audience whispered softly, wondering if she could play another piece with the same emotion as before. The lights felt a little warmer on her face, making her blink as she lifted her trembling hands over the keys. She looked at the broken notebook resting on the stand. The pages fluttered gently from the draft moving across the stage. Her fingers hovered uncertainly above the piano, and for a moment it seemed like she might freeze. Even the pianist noticed the small shake in her wrists. His expression shifted again, partly curious and partly concerned. Though he tried not to show it, the girl took another breath. But this time it did not calm her fear. Her mind filled with doubts. What if the first song was just luck? What if the judges now expected too much? What if the famous pianist believed she did not belong here? These thoughts tangled inside her, making her heart beat faster. She pressed one key gently, but the soft sound came out uneven. A few people in the audience exchanged looks as if worried she would fail this second time. The famous pianist leaned back with his arms crossed, waiting to see if she would break under the pressure. The room seemed to grow heavier with expectation. Then her eyes landed on the small smudge on the corner of her notebook. A faint stain, almost invisible from far away. It was the mark left from the day she cried while writing down a melody she couldn't finish. She remembered that moment clearly. She had been sitting on the floor of her small living room, trying to compose something new on the old keyboard that often refused to play the right notes. She remembered the voice she wished she could still hear every day. A voice that always told her to try again. A voice that said mistakes were part of music and part of life. A voice that said she should never stop playing. She remembered the warmth of someone sitting beside her, even when the piano was broken and the room felt cold. She remembered the gentle encouragement, the soft smile, the promise she made to keep playing no matter what. That memory steadied her breathing. It flowed through her like a quiet light pushing away the fear. She straightened her back slightly, her shoulders relaxing as she looked down at the keys again. Her fingers no longer shook the same way. The famous pianist noticed the change. He leaned forward, uncrossing his arms without realizing it. The judges paused their whispering and focused on her hands. The audience slowly leaned closer as if sensing something was about to shift. The girl pressed the first note again. But this time it came out clear, warm, and steady. The sound filled the hall in a soft wave. Her fingers moved to the next keys with gentle confidence. Not rushed, not hesitant. The second note matched the first perfectly. And the melody began to form like a soft whisper spreading around the room. The judges listened, their expressions softening again as they followed the rise and fall of the notes. The audience fell silent as her playing grew stronger. The famous pianist did not smile or frown. He simply listened with a growing sense of unexpected respect. Her new melody was different from the first one. It was quieter at the beginning, almost like a secret only she understood. But with every passing moment, it grew deeper, fuller, and more emotional. It felt like a conversation between her heart and the piano, like she was telling a story she could not say in words. Her fingers glided smoothly now, moving with natural control. Every note blended into the next with soft honesty. The room felt colder in contrast to the warmth the music carried. Her melody rose gently, then dipped into softer tones that made the air feel fragile. As she reached the middle section, the notes shifted into something richer, something that made people sit up straighter. Her hands moved faster but never lost their steadiness. Even the pianist's eyebrows lifted as he watched her hands sweep across the keyboard with a kind of instinct that could not be taught easily. The girl was not thinking of the judges anymore. She was thinking of the promise she had made. She promised to keep playing even when things became hard. She promised to honor the person she missed. She promised to never let fear silence the music inside her. And in that moment, the music became her courage. The melody built into a soft swell, rising just enough to make the audience feel like something inside them was being gently lifted. The pianist leaned forward slightly, unable to hide his fascination anymore. The judges sat still, mesmerized by the surprising power growing from such a young performer. Her hands moved with new purpose, her expression calm and focused. Each note carried the feeling of someone reaching beyond fear and into something deeper. The hall felt like it was breathing with her, rising and falling with the music she shaped from memory and heart. When the final note faded into the quiet hall, the room did not erupt in sound. It simply remained still, as if every person inside needed a moment to understand what they had just heard. The famous pianist looked at the girl, really looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes showed something close to admiration for a long few seconds. The hall stayed completely still after her second melody faded. It felt like the space around the audience had changed, as if the air itself was holding on to the last note. Even the lights seemed softer, glowing gently on the piano and the small girl seated before it. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her breathing calm for the first time since she stepped on stage. Then one of the judges leaned forward and whispered something under their breath, not loud enough for anyone to hear. Another judge gently tapped a pen against the table, a soft rhythmic sound like they were trying to match the last note she played. The famous pianist, however, sat frozen, his eyes narrowed, his posture still, something unspoken shifting in his expression. He cleared his throat as if trying to reset his thoughts, then said quietly, "Play the middle section again." His voice was not sharp or dismissive now. It carried curiosity, almost disbelief. The girl blinked, surprised by the request, but nodded gently. She placed her hands on the keys once more. Her fingers brushed the surface, as if greeting an old friend. She took a calm breath and started again, but this time she changed it. She did not repeat the section exactly as before. Instead, she added a few new touches, tiny changes, soft transitions, gentle pauses, each one making the melody richer. The hall leaned forward like a single body. The shift was small but powerful. It was the kind of detail only someone who truly understood music could create. The pianist's lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something, but the words got stuck before leaving his mouth. Her music filled the room again, but it did not feel like a simple repetition. It felt like the melody had grown older within seconds, like it carried more experience, more meaning. Her hands moved with confidence beyond her age, each note placed with purpose, each moment guiding the next like a story unfolding naturally. The judges exchanged slow glances. One judge mouthed the word impossible. Another scribbled something quickly on their paper. But their hands shook slightly. The audience felt the change too. They had expected a second good performance. But not this level of growth, not this sudden rise in depth and emotion. The girl was not performing, now she was speaking through the piano. Her shoulders relaxed, her eyes half closed, her hands flowing gently in a way that made it hard to look away. Every note sounded like a memory. Every shift felt like a quiet confession. The music entered the room like a soft wave, touching each person differently, but deeply. Halfway through the section, she introduced a surprising run of higher notes, delicate and light, sounding almost like a soft laugh hidden inside the music. The audience held their breath without meaning to. The melody dipped after that, landing in a lower, heavier tone, like a sigh that held stories no one else could fully understand. The famous pianist leaned closer now, both elbows on his knees. His eyes moved quickly between her hands and the notebook on the stand. He scanned the scribbled lines, the faint pencil marks, the erased corrections. Everything looked raw, imperfect, human, and absolutely original. He finally whispered, almost to himself, "Who taught you to do that?" It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a genuine question, one even he couldn't answer through theory or training. The girl didn't hear him clearly, but she felt the energy shift. She continued to play, letting the music answer for her. Her melody rose again, lifting the room gently with it. The sound carried warmth, grief, hope, and something else, something only she knew how to express. Her tiny changes reshaped the entire song, turning it into something fuller, something alive. The hall felt almost sacred in that moment, as if her music had the power to slow down time. When she hit the final soft note of the section, it drifted like a faint echo across the hall. Then the silence returned, deeper than before. Not a single seat moved, not a single cough, not a shuffle. Even the air seemed still, waiting. One of the judges finally whispered, "A child didn't write that." But the judge beside them shook their heads slowly and said, "But she did." Their voices were quiet, filled with confusion and respect. The famous pianist exhaled for the first time in minutes, a long, slow breath, like he had forgotten to breathe during her playing. He looked at her with new eyes, not as a child, not as a beginner, but as an artist. He leaned back and said softly, "Do you understand what you just did?" She did not reply. Her fingers simply rested on the keys, her gaze gentle. Unsure why everyone seemed so stunned, she wasn't aware of how deeply her music had reached the people in the room. She didn't know that some audience members felt their eyes sting with sudden emotion. She didn't know that one judge felt a memory rise in their chest, the way the melody rose a moment ago. She didn't know the famous pianist was questioning everything he believed about talent and age. All she knew was that she had shared something important, something personal. She closed the notebook gently, her fingers tracing the bent cover. She looked at the judges with quiet honesty, ready for whatever came next. The room remained frozen in awe, waiting for the first brave person to speak. But no one did, not yet, because everyone was still trying to understand how a child had just created something far beyond what they expected from someone so small and quiet. For a long moment, the hall remained still, as if someone had wrapped the entire room in quiet cloth. The girl sat at the piano with her hands resting on her legs, while her broken notebook stayed open on the stand. The judges stared at her with expressions filled with questions they did not know how to ask. And at the far end of the table, the famous pianist sat leaning forward, unmoving, as if his thoughts had frozen in place. Then something unexpected happened. The pianist slowly rose from his chair, not with a dramatic gesture, not with the intention to impress anyone. He simply stood up without even realizing he had done it. His eyes were fixed on the girl, his focus sharp and deep. The audience gasped quietly, because it was rare, almost unheard of, for someone of his status to stand during an audition. The judges turned toward him in surprise. One whispered, "Is he standing?" Another shook their head slowly, unable to understand why his reaction was so strong. But the pianist did not hear any of them. His gaze stayed on the girl, studying her as if seeing her for the very first time. The girl looked up timidly, not fully understanding what was happening. She saw him standing but did not know what it meant. Her heart beat a little faster, not from fear but from confusion. She wondered if she had played something wrong, something that made him leave his seat. She gently touched the edge of her notebook for comfort. The pianist stepped closer to the stage, his shoes making soft sounds against the floor. Each step was slow, unplanned, almost hesitant. As he came nearer, the audience leaned forward, their breaths held tight. It was unusual to see him abandon his judging seat. Yet here he was walking toward a small girl with a worn-out notebook. He reached the edge of the stage and stopped. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than anyone expected. "Play the last part again," he said. But the tone was not demanding. It was almost gentle, as if he were asking rather than ordering. The girl nodded carefully. She shifted her weight on the stool and placed her hands on the keys once more. The hall grew silent again, even more silent than before. She took a slow breath, then started to play the final part of her song. This time, her playing carried a different feeling. It had the same emotion, the same heart, but now there was something else, something braver. She held the high notes longer, letting them float through the air like small lanterns. She softened the lower notes until they felt like whispers resting on the floor. The pianist closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the sound. When he opened them again, something in his expression had changed. His usual confidence had softened into wonder, and his usual judgment had shifted into respect. The judges noticed the change too. Their eyes darted between him and the girl, trying to understand what was happening between them. The melody continued to grow, carrying the faint heartbeat of memories she held close. She pressed the keys with care, with gentle strength, and the sound that poured out felt larger than her small frame. It felt like the music was speaking for her, telling every person in the room that talent isn't measured by age or appearance, but by sincerity and truth. As she reached the last line of her melody, her hands slowed. The final note drifted out like a small feather being blown softly through the air. It landed in the quiet of the hall and stayed there, resting in everyone's chest. The pianist exhaled deeply, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. He looked at the girl with an expression no one had ever seen on his face, not on stage, not in interviews, not in countless concerts. It was humility. He turned to the judges, his voice low but steady. "That wasn't a performance," he said. "That was music." The judges stared at him, shocked by the certainty in his words. They had seen him critique world-class performers without blinking, but here he stood praising a young girl who carried her music in a damaged notebook. The girl blinked, unsure how to respond. She held her notebook close, almost hiding behind it. The pianist stepped back slightly and said gently, "Where did you learn to write like that?" She looked at him, hesitating before answering softly. "At home," she said. "I just listened to my heart." The pianist smiled, not a proud smile, not a teasing one, but a quiet, respectful smile. "Your heart," he repeated, as if tasting the meaning of the words. He nodded slowly, as though understanding something important he had forgotten long ago. The judges whispered quietly again, but this time their voices carried admiration instead of doubt. The audience remained still, watching every moment unfold, as if witnessing a rare and delicate scene that might disappear if they moved too quickly. The pianist took one more long look at the girl and then returned to his seat. He sat quietly, resting his hands on the table, but his eyes stayed on her as if he had discovered something precious that he didn't want to lose sight of. And for the first time that day, the girl felt seen, not as a child, not as a beginner, but as someone whose music had reached a place no one expected. When the girl finished playing the final note, it drifted across the hall like a tiny light floating into the dark. It held in the air longer than any sound she had ever made, and slowly, gently, it dissolved into complete silence. The silence was not empty, though. It felt full of emotion, full of surprise, full of something no one could put into words. The girl kept her hands on the piano for a moment, not because she planned to play again, but because she was afraid that if she moved too quickly, the fragile magic in the air might break. She looked down at the keys instead of the crowd, not knowing the effect she had on every person sitting before her. The judges sat frozen in their seats, pens still in their hands. One judge had stopped halfway through writing and didn't realize the pen had touched the paper so long that a small ink spot formed. Another judge stared at the girl with wide eyes, as if seeing a rare piece of art for the first time. The third judge looked quietly emotional, blinking slowly to process the moment. The audience also remained still. Not even a single cough or shuffle passed through the crowd. People sat completely motionless, almost afraid to breathe, afraid to ruin the lingering echo of her music. They had expected a simple performance, maybe something sweet or charming, but not a moment that would touch their hearts in such an unexpected way. The famous pianist, who had stood earlier without realizing it, now sat with both hands pressed against his lips. He stared at the girl with a thoughtful gaze. His eyes looked softer than before, not filled with pride or judgment anymore, but with something closer to awe. He whispered something only he could hear, then lowered his hands slowly. His expression held a quiet humility, like someone who had just witnessed something profound, something that shifted his view of music itself. The girl, however, did not look up. She lowered her hands from the keys and rested them on her lap. She touched her broken notebook gently, almost like thanking it for guiding her through the performance. She had no idea that her playing had changed the entire energy of the hall. She only knew she had done her best, and that was enough for her. The silence stretched on, long and deep. The audience felt it first, the realization that the performance was truly over. A woman in the second row pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breath. A man beside her blinked several times as if waking from a dream. People looked at one another with expressions of quiet amazement. Still, no one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how to begin. The atmosphere felt too delicate, too meaningful. It was like holding a glass ornament that could break if handled too quickly. The judges finally gained a little awareness. One judge leaned toward the microphone but didn't speak, their voice caught in their throat. Another judge took off their glasses slowly and wiped their eyes with the back of their hand. The famous pianist sat straighter now, as if preparing to stand again but stopping himself, not wanting to overwhelm the girl with attention. Finally, the girl lifted her head. Her eyes scanned the quiet room. She saw people staring at her with soft, gentle expressions, not judgment or doubt like before. She felt her heart flutter nervously, wondering if the silence meant something bad. She hugged her notebook a little tighter, unsure of what to expect. At that small movement, something shifted in the hall. It was as if the audience realized that the moment belonged to her, and they needed to honor it. A single person in the back row slowly rose to their feet. Their hands came together in one gentle clap. Then another, then another. The sound was soft at first, like rain beginning to fall, but then more people rose, and the clapping grew louder, warmer, stronger. The hall filled with applause that echoed beautifully, rising higher than the ceiling lights and spreading across every seat. It was no longer just clapping, it was appreciation, admiration, and gratitude woven together. The girl stared at the crowd in disbelief. Her small lips parted as she realized the applause was for her. Her hands shook slightly as she held the notebook to her chest. Tears gathered quietly at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, not wanting to lose control on stage. The famous pianist finally stood, this time with intention. His posture was tall but not proud. He walked toward the edge of the stage once more. His steps carried purpose but not pressure. His face held a calm, respectful expression as he watched the girl take in the applause she deserved. He did not smile widely or dramatically, but his eyes held warmth like soft candlelight. He nodded once toward her, a quiet gesture of recognition. The girl saw him and looked surprised again. She lowered her notebook respectfully, unsure what such a gesture meant from someone like him. The judges also stood, following the pianist's lead. Their applause was slower but steady, their expressions filled with genuine admiration. They knew they were witnessing something rare, something that would stay in their memories long after the audition was over. For the first time during the whole event, the girl allowed herself a small, trembling smile. She felt the warmth of the applause reach her heart, wrapping around her like a gentle blanket. She did not feel small anymore. She did not feel out of place. She felt seen, understood, and appreciated. And as the applause continued to rise around her, she realized something quietly powerful. Her music had spoken for her, and the world had listened. The applause rose higher and higher until it filled every corner of the hall. It rolled across the room like a warm wave, touching every person and echoing against the walls. But for the little girl on the stage, the sound felt unreal. She stood frozen beside the piano, clutching her broken notebook to her chest as if afraid the moment would slip away if she let go. Her breath trembled as she looked out at the sea of people standing for her. Their faces were soft, their eyes warm. Some had gentle smiles, others looked emotional, and a few wiped quiet tears from their cheeks. She had never seen so many people stand at once, not for someone like her. Not for someone small, unnoticed, and carrying a worn-out book of scribbles. Her hands shook gently, not from fear now, but from overwhelming emotion. She tried to steady her breathing. But the applause kept growing, louder, fuller, as if every person wanted to be sure she felt the love and respect they were offering. She hugged her notebook closer, feeling the edges press against her fingers. Up front, the judges remained standing too. Their applause was slower but meaningful. One judge nodded at her several times, as if telling her she had done something truly special. Another judge placed a hand over their heart, an honest gesture that made the girl's eyes sting with emotion. The third judge simply stared at her with admiration that words couldn't express. And then she saw him, the famous pianist, standing among them. His posture was straight but relaxed, his hands coming together in a steady, respectful rhythm. He wasn't clapping because he had to. He wasn't clapping out of politeness. His expression held something deeper, something warm, something she never expected to see on his face. His eyes met hers for a moment, and in that brief connection, she felt seen in a way she never had before. Not as a child, not as a beginner, but as a musician. Someone whose music had reached him enough to soften his pride and quiet his doubts. The applause lasted so long that the girl didn't know what to do. She kept standing still, unsure if she should bow or step back or smile. Her breath hitched when she felt tears rise again. This time, she didn't blink them away quickly. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Then another. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of disbelief, of relief, of joy she had never known could feel so big. The crowd seemed to notice her tears, and the applause changed tone, becoming softer, more tender, as if encouraging her to let her heart feel everything without hiding it. She lifted her free hand slowly and brushed at her cheek. But the tears kept falling anyway. The famous pianist finally stepped forward, stopping right in front of the stage. He raised a hand gently, signaling the audience to pause. The applause softened like a wave pulling back from the shore, not ending completely, but settling enough for his voice to carry. He looked up at her with steady eyes, then spoke with a tone no one had ever heard from him during an audition. "You played with heart," he said. His voice did not tremble, but something warm lived inside it. "Real music comes from the heart. And yours is rare." The judges glanced at each other. Surprised but moved, the audience listened in quiet excitement. Waiting to hear what he would say next, the girl stared at him with wide eyes. Unsure if she should speak or stay silent, he continued. "We live in a world full of perfect technique," he said. "Perfect posture, perfect training," he gestured lightly with his hand. "But what you gave us today was something deeper." He paused, letting the words sink into the hearts of everyone watching. The girl pressed her notebook against her chest again. Feeling the rough edges under her fingertips, she wanted to speak, but her voice stayed trapped behind her emotion. For the first time, she felt like she didn't need to explain anything. Her music had already spoken for her. The pianist stepped closer, still keeping a respectful distance from the stage. "Your notebook," he said gently. "That's where your music lives." The girl nodded a little, her tears still sliding softly down her cheeks. He smiled faintly, not a wide smile, but enough to soften his whole expression. "Guard it," he said, "because what you wrote inside it is priceless." The audience let out a soft ripple of agreement, a warm murmur that echoed like a gentle wind through the hall. The judges nodded as well, each one touched by the simple truth in his words. The girl finally managed to speak, her voice thin but steady. "Thank you," she whispered. The microphone caught her voice and carried it across the room. The word was small, but it held so much gratitude that the audience felt their hearts tighten again. The pianist stepped back, letting the judges take the lead now. One judge leaned into the microphone and said softly, "We are honored, truly honored to have heard you today." Another added, "You didn't just play, you shared something beautiful with all of us." The applause returned, gentle but strong. The girl bowed her head, tears falling freely now even though she tried to hold them back. She felt the warmth of the hall wrap around her like an embrace she had long waited for. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a quiet child with a broken notebook. She was someone whose music touched the hearts of hundreds, someone who had made an entire hall stand up in awe. And as the applause rose again, she felt one simple truth settle in her heart: she belonged here. The applause slowly softened again, settling into a warm hum that floated across the hall like a gentle breeze. The girl stood on the stage with her broken notebook held close, her small hands gripping it as if it were the most precious thing she owned. She could still feel her heartbeat rushing from everything that had happened, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from something brighter, something she had never felt before. The judges sat down at last, but their eyes remained fixed on her with a level of respect she never imagined she would receive. People in the audience returned to their seats as well, some still wiping quiet tears from their cheeks. Yet many continued to smile at her with the kind of fondness usually given to someone who had changed the mood of an entire room. Only the famous pianist remained standing. His posture was calm, his expression thoughtful. His eyes stayed on her as if he was studying every small detail: her gentle hands, her notebook, her shy posture, her quiet strength. He looked like someone who had found an answer to a question he didn't know he had been asking. The girl lowered her head shyly, unsure what to do next. She had never been on a stage before this day. She didn't know when to step down or how to leave gracefully. She simply stood there waiting for someone to guide her. Sensing her confusion, the famous pianist stepped forward again. His steps were slow, respectful, deliberate. He reached the edge of the stage and looked up at her with an expression that felt softer than anything he had shown earlier. The entire hall went quiet without being asked. Waiting for what he would say, his voice was steady but warm. "Would you show me your notebook?" he asked. The girl hesitated, not out of fear, but out of surprise. She slowly stepped closer to the edge of the stage and held the notebook toward him. He accepted it gently, almost carefully. As if afraid the worn cover might fall apart in his hands, he opened it slowly. studying the pages filled with pencil marks, erased lines, handwriting that tilted slightly and carried small human imperfections. Every page looked alive, like it had been touched by someone who poured feelings into each note rather than technique alone. He flipped through a few pages, reading the melodies written in a way that only the girl herself fully understood. Some parts were neat, some messy, some nearly smudged away, but all of it felt genuine. He closed the notebook softly and looked up at her again. "Your music," he said, "is honest." The girl blinked. Unsure how to respond, he continued, "People search their whole lives to play with this kind of truth." He took a breath, his voice dropping even softer. "You already have it." A quiet tremble passed through the hall. The audience listened like they were hearing a confession from someone who had never spoken this openly before. The judges nodded to themselves, their faces showing complete agreement. The pianist then held the notebook toward her. "You play with your heart," he said. "And that's something no one can teach in a classroom." She stepped forward to take it, her hands brushing his just slightly, her fingers trembling again, but this time with a different emotion. She held the notebook close to her chest again, her voice barely above a whisper when she managed to say, "Thank you." Her gratitude felt pure, unpolished and real. The pianist smiled softly, something rare and almost unfamiliar on his face. He shook his head gently and replied, "No. Thank you." Then, in front of the entire hall, he said something no one expected to hear. His voice carried clearly through the quiet room. "Would you teach me how you play with your heart?" The judge's eyes widened. The audience gasped softly. People leaned forward in disbelief. The famous pianist, the man who had mastered technique, theory, and reputation, was asking a small girl with a broken notebook to teach him something he felt he lacked. The girl stared at him, unsure how to react. Her throat tightened with emotion. She didn't know how to teach anyone anything, especially someone who seemed so far above her in the world of music. She shook her head lightly, confused. "I don't know how to teach," she whispered. He smiled again, not a forced smile, not a stage smile, but a gentle one filled with sincerity. "You already did," he said. "Through your music." He pressed his hand to his chest, a soft gesture that echoed her earlier playing. "You reminded me why I started playing long ago." There was another ripple of emotion through the hall. Soft and honest, the audience felt something settle deep within them, a moment they knew they would remember for a long time. The judge at the center finally leaned forward to the microphone and said, "Young lady, you are going to the next stage without hesitation," another judge added. "Your gift deserves to be heard by the world." The third judge nodded and said simply, "You are extraordinary." The girl stood there trembling, not from fear or sadness, but from pure, overwhelming joy. Her cheeks warmed, her eyes filled again. She covered her mouth with her hand as more tears slid down her face. Gentle and grateful, the audience rose for a second standing ovation. Softer than the first, but even more heartfelt. Some people wiped tears, others held their hands to their hearts. The girl finally bowed her head deeply, holding her notebook close like a treasure. Because she now understood something beautiful. Her music had touched people. Her heart had spoken louder than her age, and the world had listened as she walked off the stage. She carried a truth she would never forget. The moment she thought she was too small to be seen was the moment she shined the brightest.